I'm not surprised that people are frustrated. I completely get that. The truth is, since the crash in '08, most people haven't seen their living standards improved.
I've got 2 daughters, Patrick, and I've never been so scared of the future of Britain. You know, I'm actively trying to see how maybe I can get out. I'm petrified for the future of my kids, especially my 2 girls. I'm pretty confident that if I left this studio now and went and randomly attacked 3 women, abused them, called them prostitutes and other names, that I would be arrested and I would expect to go to prison. Now, the fact that that hasn't happened is worrying to me. Again, I think we're seeing 2-tier policing, 2-tier justice, and we've got a 2-tier Prime Minister in this country, and a 2-tier media. The way things are treated.
Wow, listen to this.
And
the real risk you have in the US isn't multiculturalism. It's a multi-billionaire running the biggest social media planet, one of the biggest in the world, which has turned into an echo chamber of your ridiculous ideology. And the fact that you're telling us all and telling the British public, who we're proudly multicultural, as someone that was brought up in multicultural working class Birmingham, I can tell you for sure that there's not you won't find a Muslim there who's read the Quran and went, oh, you know what, I didn't rule out sexual violence, so I might just crack on with that. I don't know what planet you're living on or what you're smoking, but I'd suggest that you do a course in religious studies before you start chatting.
Well, thank you for the ad hominem attacks. I'm sure that
Keir Starmer's world just came crashing down in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. 3 minutes ago, in scenes of absolute parliamentary chaos that are still unfolding as we speak, Rebel MPs from across the political spectrum successfully triggered a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister after revelations of what they're calling a complete Brexit surrender to the European Union. Starmer erupted in visible fury on the floor of the House of Commons, his carefully controlled lawyer's demeanour shattering as he realised that his own MPs were joining forces with the opposition to bring down his government. The triggering of this vote wasn't just a routine political manoeuvre. It followed the leak of secret documents showing that Starmer's government has been negotiating agreements with Brussels that would effectively reverse Brexit through the back door, binding Britain to EU regulations, accepting freedom of movement provisions, and surrendering the sovereignty that 17 million people voted for in the referendum. The betrayal is so comprehensive, so calculated, and so contrary to everything Starmer promised voters that even loyal Labour MPs are now in open revolt. Parliament is in absolute turmoil. The Conservative opposition is celebrating. Nigel Farage is calling this the greatest political betrayal in modern British history. And the confidence vote that will determine Starmer's fate is now just hours away. This is the moment when a Prime Minister's carefully constructed lies finally caught up with him, and Britain is about to witness a political reckoning unlike anything seen in a generation. The crisis began early this morning when a massive cache of classified government documents was leaked to multiple news organisations simultaneously. These weren't vague policy papers or speculative drafts. These were formal negotiating positions, draft treaty texts and internal government communications that revealed the stunning extent of the Starmer government's secret negotiations with the European Union. The documents showed that Britain had agreed in principle to regulatory alignment across virtually every major sector of the economy, effectively accepting EU rules without having any say in making them. They revealed plans to allow significantly increased immigration from EU countries under a new framework that looked remarkably similar to the freedom of movement that Brexit was supposed to have ended. Most damningly, they included internal government assessments, acknowledging that these agreements would effectively reverse the practical effects of Brexit while maintaining the technical fiction that Britain had left the EU. The leak was comprehensive, devastating, and clearly came from someone senior within the government who had decided that the British people needed to know what was being done in their name. The documents were published simultaneously by 3 major newspapers at 7 o'clock this morning, ensuring maximum impact and making it impossible for the government to suppress or spin the story. The headlines were brutal and unambiguous. Secret Brexit surrender exposed, screamed the Telegraph. Starmer's EU sellout revealed, declared the Mail. Even the normally more measured Times, led with government secret EU deal, would reverse Brexit. The detailed reporting that accompanied these headlines made clear that this wasn't opposition spin or exaggeration. These were actual government documents authenticated by multiple sources that proved beyond any doubt that the Starmer government had been systematically working to undo Brexit while publicly claiming to respect the referendum result. The political impact was immediate and seismic, with Starmer's phone reportedly ringing non-stop from the moment the papers hit the streets. By the time Parliament convened for Prime Minister's questions at noon, the atmosphere in Westminster was unlike anything veteran MPs could remember. The public galleries were packed with citizens who had come to witness what they sensed would be a historic confrontation. The opposition benches were full and energised, with Conservative MPs clutching copies of the leaked documents and clearly preparing to use them as weapons. Even more ominously for Starmer, significant numbers of Labour backbenchers were notably absent from their usual positions behind the Prime Minister, sending a clear signal that party solidarity was fracturing. The Speaker called the House to order, but the usual procedural formalities were rushed through as everyone present understood that the real business of the day was about to begin. The leader of the opposition rose to ask his first question, and the carefully controlled theatre of PNQs was about to give way to something far more raw and consequential. The Conservative leader's opening question was devastating in its directness. He held up copies of the leaked documents and asked Starmer to confirm or deny whether his government had negotiated the specific provisions detailed in the papers. He read aloud several of the most damaging passages, including one internal memo where a senior minister had written that we need to present these agreements in ways that obscure their practical effect of restoring many aspects of EU membership without the public fully understanding what we're doing. The quote was politically lethal, suggesting not just policy disagreement, but deliberate deception of the British public. The Conservative leader asked whether Starmer thought it was acceptable to secretly negotiate away the Brexit that 17 million people had voted for, and demanded that he explain to the House and to the country why he had betrayed the democratic mandate of the referendum. Starmer's response was immediately defensive and notably unconvincing. He claimed that the leaked documents were taken out of context and that the government's negotiations with the EU were simply pragmatic arrangements to facilitate trade and cooperation. He insisted that Britain remained outside the European Union and that all the fundamental aspects of Brexit remained intact. But even as he spoke these words, MPs on all sides were shaking their heads in disbelief. The leaked documents were too specific, too detailed, and too unambiguous to be explained away as misunderstandings or routine diplomatic cooperation. When Starmer claimed that concerns about sovereignty were overblown and that practical arrangements required some regulatory alignment, he was essentially confirming the court accusations while trying to minimise their significance. The evasiveness and defensiveness of his response convinced even neutral observers that the allegations were fundamentally true. The questions that followed from opposition MPs were relentless and brutal. One after another, they rose to confront Starmer with specific details from the leaked documents, asking him to explain particular agreements or internal communications. Each question exposed more of the systematic nature of the Brexit betrayal, the careful planning that had gone into presenting these arrangements to minimise public awareness and backlash. When a Scottish nationalist MP asked whether the Prime Minister thought voters in Scotland who had opposed Brexit would appreciate being dragged back into EU arrangements without their consent or even knowledge, Starmer's fumbling response suggested he understood that he was trapped. There was no good answer, no spin that could make this look like anything other than what it was, a deliberate attempt to reverse Brexit without admitting that was what the government was doing. Then came the moment that would define the entire crisis. A Labour backbencher AMP from a traditional working class constituency in the Midlands that had voted heavily for Brexit rose to ask a question. The chamber fell silent because everyone understood the significance. This wasn't opposition attacking the government. This was one of Starmer's own MPs, someone who was supposed to be supporting him, preparing to deliver what could be a fatal blow. The MP asked, in a voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion, how the Prime Minister expected working-class Labour voters to ever trust the party again when he had secretly betrayed the Brexit vote that so many of them had seen as their chance to reclaim control from distant elites. She stated that she had received hundreds of messages from constituents overnight, people who felt profoundly betrayed, and she asked Starmer directly, "Do you have any sense of shame about what you've done to these people and to the democratic process?" Starmer's response to his own MP's question was the moment when his composure finally cracked. His face flushed red, and when he spoke, his voice was raised to a near shout, abandoning the measured tones that usually characterised his performances. He accused the MP of disloyalty, of playing into the hands of the opposition, of not understanding the complexities of governing in the real world. He claimed that he was trying to do what was best for Britain's economy and for working people's living standards, and that simplistic notions of sovereignty needed to give way to practical arrangements that actually worked. The anger in his voice and the contemptuous dismissal of concerns about democratic accountability revealed something his critics had long suspected. Starmer genuinely believed that voters' preference for Brexit was wrong and that his job was to fix their mistake rather than to respect their democratic choice. The mask had slipped, and what was revealed was a Prime Minister who viewed public opinion as an obstacle rather than as a democratic mandate he was obligated to respect. The chamber erupted into chaos following Starmer's outburst. Opposition MPs were on their feet shouting, "Resign, resign," while Labour backbench chairs sat in stunned silence at their leader's public meltdown. The Speaker had to suspend the session for 10 minutes to restore order, but when PMQs reconvened, the damage was done. Starmer had confirmed through his own words and demeanour that the leaked documents told the truth, that his government had indeed been working to reverse Brexit, and that he viewed concerns about this as politically inconvenient rather than as legitimate democratic feedback. The images of Starmer's red-faced fury, of his barely controlled rage at being challenged by his own MPs would be played endlessly on news programmes and shared millions of times on social media. This was the moment when a Prime Minister lost control, not just of Parliament, but of himself, revealing the contempt and arrogance that had been hidden beneath the professional facade. As PMQs concluded in chaos, frantic meetings were taking place throughout Westminster as MPS tried to determine what should happen next. Conservative whips were coordinating with Reform UK MPS and with some Liberal Democrats to discuss the possibility of triggering a vote of no confidence in the government. Normally, such coordination across party lines would be difficult to achieve, but the Brexit betrayal had created a rare moment of multi-party unity around a single objective, removing Keir Starmer from office. The leaked documents and Starmer's disastrous PMQ's performance had created conditions where MPs who disagreed on almost everything else could agree that the Prime Minister had lost the moral authority to govern. The question was whether they could move quickly enough to capitalise on the moment before government spin doctors could muddy the waters and provide political cover for wavering Labour MPs. Within the Labour Party itself, a full-scale rebellion was brewing. The MP who had challenged Starmer during PMQs was being hailed as a hero by grassroots party members who felt betrayed by the leadership's direction. Multiple other backbenchers were reportedly meeting to discuss whether they could, in good conscience, continue supporting a Prime Minister who had so flagrantly violated the democratic mandate of the Brexit referendum. MPS from Leave You Voting constituencies were receiving torrents of angry communications from constituents demanding to know that whether their MP would stand with them or with a Prime Minister who had betrayed their vote. The political pressure on individual Labour MPs was immense, with many recognising that voting to sustain Starmer could mean losing their seats at the next election. The tribal loyalty that normally kept parliamentary parties united was fracturing under the weight of this specific betrayal. By mid-afternoon, the formal process of triggering a no-confidence vote was underway. Opposition parties had secured the required number of signatures to force a vote, but more significantly, they had confirmation that at least 15 Labour MPs were prepared to vote against their own government or to abstain, which would have the same practical effect. The news that Starmer faced potential defeat at the hands of his own MPs sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Prime ministers could survive opposition attacks, but they could not survive their own party abandoning them in a confidence vote. The mathematics were brutal. If even a dozen Labour MPs voted against the government or abstained, Starmer would lose, his government would fall, and Britain would be facing either a change of government or new elections. The confidence vote was scheduled for the following day, giving MPs less than 24 hours to make decisions that would shape British politics for years to come. Downing Street went into crisis mode, with Starmer's team working frantically to shore up support and prevent a catastrophic defeat. Ministers were deployed to give media and interviews, attempting to justify the government's approach to EU relations and to downplay the significance of the leaked documents. The message they were instructed to deliver was that the government remained committed to Brexit, but that practical cooperation with Europe was necessary for economic reasons. But this messaging was falling flat because the leaked documents made clear that this wasn't just practical cooperation, but systematic restoration of EU control over British policy. Government spokespeople found themselves unable to answer direct questions about specific provisions in the documents, forced instead to rely on vague talking points that convinced nobody. The PR battle was being comprehensively lost. The Chief Whip was engaged in desperate one-on-one meetings with every potentially wavering Labour MP, employing the full arsenal of threats and inducements available to part leadership. MPs were told that voting against the government would mean immediate expulsion from the party, loss of committee positions, and withdrawal of support in their constituencies. They were offered policy concessions on issues they cared about, promised ministerial positions or other advancement, and subjected to emotional appeals about party loyalty and solidarity. But the pressure was running both ways. These same MPs were also hearing from their constituents, from local party branches, and from their own consciences about the betrayal of Brexit and democratic principles. For many, particularly those representing Leave voting constituencies, the calculation was brutal. Supporting Starmer might preserve their party careers but would guarantee electoral defeat, while opposing him would end their time in Labour but might allow them to maintain credibility with voters. Public opinion was crystallising with remarkable speed and clarity. Polling conducted in the hours after the document leak and Starmer's PMQ's meltdown showed a dramatic collapse in support for both the Prime Minister personally and for his government. Large majorities agreed that Starmer had betrayed Brexit and had lied to voters about his intentions. Even more significantly, polling showed that this sentiment was strongest among working class voters in traditional Labour heartlands, the very constituencies that the party needed to win elections. Focus groups revealed deep anger and a sense of betrayal that went beyond normal political disagreement. These were people who felt that their democratic voice had been deliberately ignored and undermined by a political class that viewed their concerns with contempt. The political damage was severe and potentially permanent. Nigel Farage, sensing the moment, announced an emergency press conference where he delivered what many would consider the most important speech of his political career. He positioned the Brexit betrayal as confirming everything he and other Brexit supporters had been warning about, that the political establishment had never accepted the referendum result and had been working systematically to reverse it while pretending to implement it. Farage argued that Starmer's downfall was necessary not just because he had lied, but because accepting such betrayal would mean accepting that referendum results could be ignored whenever elites disagreed with them. He called the confidence vote a test of whether British democracy still functioned or whether it had been reduced to a hollow ritual where ordinary people's votes meant nothing if they produced results that the establishment disliked. The speech was powerful, passionate, and perfectly calibrated to the anger that millions of Brexiteers were feeling. Within hours, it had been viewed tens of millions of times online, becoming one of the most watched British political speeches in recent memory. International reaction to the crisis was intense and divided. European Union officials maintained public neutrality, but were privately reported to be furious that the leaked documents had exposed their own role in negotiating these arrangements with the Starmer government. They had been promised discretion and gradual implementation that would avoid political backlash, and now they found themselves accused of conspiring to undermine British democracy. Some EU leaders expressed sympathy for Starmer's predicament, suggesting that Brexit had always been a mistake and that trying to maintain practical cooperation with Europe was simply good governance. But others were more cynical, recognising that Starmer's fall would make any future British government much more cautious about close alignment with Brussels. The entire episode was demonstrating the fundamental problem with trying to reverse a referendum result through administrative arrangements rather than through honest democratic debate. Eventually, the deception would be exposed and the backlash would be severe. As evening fell on Westminster, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation of the following day's confidence vote. Betting markets suggested the vote was genuinely too close to call, with some bookmakers refusing to take large bets because the outcome was so uncertain. News organisations cleared their schedules to provide extended live coverage of what everyone recognised would be a historic moment. Political analysts struggled to recall precedent for a Prime Minister potentially brought down by his own MPS over betrayal of a referendum result. The parallels people kept returning to were great constitutional crises of earlier eras, moments when fundamental questions about sovereignty and democratic legitimacy had to be resolved through dramatic political confrontation.